Hi everyone, welcome back to this verbal reasoning section on reading comprehension. If you haven't watched the video before this, you definitely want to go watch the one on reading strategies. In this video, we're going to put all those strategies to use, and we're going to look at the different types of questions you might see, how to recognize what type of question you're dealing with, and strategies for each one. So what I've done here is compiled a list of the most common stems or sort of families of questions that you'll see, and right now it might not mean much to you, it's just a random jumble of things, but we will go through each one and look at some sample problems for each. So let's get started with main idea questions. Main idea questions aren't anything new to most people. Almost every type of test out there is going to have something like this. On the GRE, the questions are most often going to read the passage is primarily concerned with blank. Which of the following most accurately describes the passage? The main idea of the passage can be described as blank. Right? So if you see one of these, as well as others, you know that you're looking for the main idea of the whole passage. Dealing with this type of question starts with how you read the passage. As you're reading through the first time, you should be mainly concerned with why did the author write this? What is the main idea of this passage? If you find yourself getting to the end of passages and saying to yourself, I don't know why that was written, I don't know what that was about, you want to sort of change that. That's something you want to work on. Also, when you get this question, you want to be sure that you're thinking about the passage in the right scope. So, if a question asks you what is the main idea of the passage, you don't want to select an answer that's the main idea of just one paragraph or just one line. And oftentimes they'll be there as wrong answers, right? And the opposite of that is true as well. If they ask you what is the purpose of the second paragraph, you don't want to select what the main idea of the whole passage was, right? So even though certain answers will seem true, they will seem like things that the author did, they might not be the main idea depending on what the scope is that they're looking for. This last strategy is best used in situations where you've got it down to two answers and they both seem true, they both seem like something the author did a good job of, but you're just not sure, well, which one is the main idea? Say to yourself, well, which of these answers would have made a good prompt that would have caused the author to write this essay? There are other ways of thinking about this, but this has been the most successful for me and the people that I've worked with. Because when you do this, you'll be able to say to yourself, oh yeah, that is something the author did, but if they had turned this essay in as a response to that assignment or that prompt, it probably would have failed at that, right? And so this is one way to eliminate wrong answers that are so nearly there but aren't quite the main idea. So to practice this type of question, we're going to go to the ETS practice book, and I'll leave a link down in the description. We looked at this in the last video. And for this passage here, I know some of you are maybe pressed on time or just don't want to do this right now, but if you can, take a second, pause the video, read through this one, and we're just going to answer question 9. So if you took some time to read through that, and I know that this one is a long one and it can be a bit boring, but I hope that you were reading for the main idea, right? So we're not getting hung up on the names, the dates, the little details. We're just trying to be able to, when we get to the end of a paragraph or the end of the entire passage, we can say to ourselves, well, that's what this was about, right? And so if we look at this first paragraph, what was that generally about? Well, we have this writer, Afra Ben, and we have a critic who's writing about her, Rachel Carnell. And this first paragraph is all about sort of why did Ben change the way that she was doing things, right? So some people say that it was because she was looking for a more lucrative medium, but then it says Carnell argues that Ben um, did this in an attempt to criticize and subvert for her own ends the conventions and ideology of a well-established form of her day, dramatic tragedy. So the first one is mainly about why did Ben change the way that she wrote, according to this critic, Rachel Carnell. Looking at the second paragraph, it seems more concerned with Ben's view of what a tragedy ought to be, comparing her to other writers of the time like Dryden, and sort of what her overall purpose was for writing these tragedies. Taking a look at the answers, let's see if we can try to figure out, well, which one most closely aligns with the main idea. So A, tracing how Ben's view of the nature of tragedy changed over time. Well, it doesn't seem quite right, because we're really just told how Ben felt about the tragedy when she was writing them, right? There isn't this sense of progression of how things changed. B, Explain one author's view of Ben's contribution to the development of an emerging literary form. So this one might be a little tempting because we do have this line, emerging literary form, the novel, right? So it is mentioned that the novel was sort of just coming about, but to say that the entire thing is just dedicated to how Aphra Behn contributed to the development of the novel would definitely not be correct, right? That's not the main idea of this passage. If we look at C, differentiating between the early and the late literary works of Behn, that's something that the author does at a certain point, so maybe we'll keep that in. D, contrasting the approaches to tragedy taken by Behn and Dryden. Again, that's something that the author does in the second paragraph, so maybe we'll leave that in. And then E, presenting one scholar's explanation for a major development in Behn's literary career. Aha. So that one sounds a lot like what the whole thing is about, right? If we consider what would have made a good prompt for this whole thing, right? Which one takes into account the entire essay? Which one is in scope? It's going to be E, right? C is something that the author does at a certain point in the first paragraph, and D is also something the author does in the second paragraph. But if we're being asked what is the primary purpose of the passage, it has to be something like E, something that encompasses from beginning to end what the passage is about. I want to take the next two types of questions together because they're closely related and they're ones that you really don't want to get mixed up. So the first one is the passage suggests, and the second one is it can be inferred. So the passage suggests are typically concerned with sort of what did the passage do, what can you justify based on a line in the passage, whereas inferring something is just, what can be reasonably assumed given all the information that you've taken in. So you might be thinking, what's the difference, right? Aren't they both just concerned with like what is true based on the passage? In some ways, but they are different. So when you have a question that says suggests, oftentimes you're looking for a single line that gives you evidence for one of your choices. And a couple of the things that you want to avoid are absolutes, which is true of both of them, and we'll take a look at those when we get to some practice questions. But you also want to avoid inference here, right? So you don't want to just say that seems likely based on what I've read. You really want to be sure of this is what the passage says, if it says the passage suggests. However, when you're dealing with an inference question, you often need to utilize multiple lines from the text. You need to pull a fact from the first paragraph and the third paragraph, and what happens when you consider them together. Again, you want to avoid absolutes, but you also want to avoid answers that are just simple restatements or just use a bunch of keywords from the passage. It's usually not that simple. Those often tend to be trap answers. Also, you want to avoid things too far out there, too nonsensical. There are certain things that you shouldn't be able to infer, right? There are things that are just either, if it seems downright wrong or just such a far reach given what you can eliminate it. Before we dive into some practice questions, let's just take a look at what is meant by avoiding absolutes. So if you've already been practicing for the GRE, you've probably run into this before. You might have even gotten some practice questions wrong because of this. Answers can change just based on one or two words in a good or a bad way. So oftentimes absolute answers are wrong. For instance, if you get a choice that says, all scientists believe that this theory is invalid. Well, unless the passage stated that explicitly, you wouldn't want to pick that, right? Chances are the passage probably didn't say that. It said something about most scientists or a majority of them believing something. And so a correct answer might read like on the right, many scientists believe that this theory is invalid. So we have a qualified answer here because all it takes, right, is one scientist out there who does believe this theory in order to make the left side wrong, but the right side can sort of be true generally, even taking into consideration some outliers. So as we look down the list, you can see this same trend, right? There are no supporters for the legislation versus there are very few supporters. Or researchers must follow such guidelines. Or researchers who follow such guidelines have a better chance of doing something, right? No other invention has had such a large impact. Few inventions have had as large an impact. So you can see that there is this trend of being extremely absolute on the left, and you want to avoid those answers, while being qualified on the right, and those tend to be the more correct answers. So let's return back to the practice book, and we're going to take the same passage again. So if you've already read it, great. If not, again, go ahead and take that, because if we look down here at questions 10, 11, and 12, we have two that read the passage suggests, and then one that says it can be inferred. So let's take a look at two of these questions, 10 and 12. So 10, the passage suggests that Carnell sees Ben's novels featuring male protagonists as differing from dramatic tragedies such as Dryden's featuring male protagonists, in that the former, so the former here we know we're looking for something that describes Ben, the first of the two things listed. So which of these accurately describes Ben's novels? And so we can see that some of these answers are just wrong, like for instance C is just describing Dryden, right? And so we can just rule those out. But other ones, for instance D is something that comes across as almost nonsensical, maybe an inference you could make. So who's going to get this question wrong with an answer like D? It's someone who, when you read it, you thought to yourself, oh yeah, Ben seems like someone very concerned about writing novels for women. D is probably true. The problem, though, is that's just an inference. There's nothing in the passage that says concretely that Ben was writing for women, right? If you were going to select that, that would be an assumption you'd make, and that would be wrong. Rather, we just need one line in the passage that backs up one of these answers, and the answer here is going to be B. Emphasize the consequence of these characters' actions in the private sphere. And if we look line 35, even in a few of her novels featuring male protagonists, Ben insists on the importance of the crimes these otherwise heroic figures commit in the domestic sphere. So what we have is just a line that is essentially reworded here in answer B, and that's precisely what we're looking for when the question is asking the passage suggests. When we go to look at 12, though, we can see that it's an inference question, and so we're looking for what is most likely to be true based on probably multiple places from the text. And so here we're looking for this artificial distinction. What is this artificial distinction referring to in the passage? So if we go up and find it, it's right here. So starting on line 50. According to Carnell, Ben's choice of literary form underscores the difference between her own approach to crafting a tragic story and that taken in the dramatic tragedies, with their artificial distinction between public and private spheres. So, just based on that line, we know that this artificial distinction is something taken by the writers of those other dramatic tragedies, in this case, probably Dryden. So, we now know that we should be assuming that this artificial distinction is a view that Dryden would have held based on how he's described. And if we go through these options, the answer ends up being D. Right? So it's an assumption made by the authors of conventional dramatic tragedies, that's Dryden, that's exactly what that line is asking for, that legitimate tragic action occurs only in the public sphere, which earlier on in the second paragraph, that is something that is spelled out as sort of a view that Dryden and other tragic writers of the time would have believed. The next question stem or question family that we want to look at is purpose of a line. And this is actually quite common. And you'll often see it like the author mentions such and such in order to blank. Which of the following best describes the purpose of line 4 or 5 or something like that? Or in the context of the passage as a whole, the primary function of this line is blank. And what you're being asked to do is not just restate what the line is saying, right? So one of the strategies, just because an option is true doesn't make it correct. So oftentimes a lot of the wrong answers are just restatements of what the line is telling you, but they aren't the reason the author put it in. But to determine what the purpose of that line is, you often want to pay close attention to transition words and phrases, and maybe read the line before and after the one in question to figure out why it's situated where it is. So words like therefore or however, or in direct contradiction to this or despite this, if you see phrases like that, that often means, well, I ought to read the line before to figure out why this is despite something or why this is however something, right? So don't just think you can read that one line and determine its purpose. And something to consider is that oftentimes what the author is doing is something active. Right? They're trying to concede a point to the other side. They're trying to account for a weakness in their argument. They're trying to illustrate a point that they're making. Right? It isn't just the information that's contained in the line. It's more than that. So to illustrate this, I've come up with a bit of a silly example, but one way that I've come to think about this type of question is if you were going to include this statement in a debate, or if you were having a conversation and you were trying to persuade someone of something, why would you include a particular line? So let's just imagine we're having a conversation and I'm trying to convince you that Alfred Hitchcock is the greatest film director of the 20th century. And so I say that. And then I go, though John Ford did win 4 Academy Awards for Best Directing to Hitchcock's 0, to say that Ford is a better director would be a mistake. Films like Psycho and Vertigo will have a far more lasting effect on future directors than any film Ford directed. So if I had said that to you, why would I have even bothered to include something like John Ford won 4 Academy Awards? Why did I tell you that? And so if you look at these three choices, right, was it to show that Ford won more awards than Hitchcock? No, that's not really my purpose for including it. Is that true, though? Yes. Right? What about B? Illustrate that awards aren't a good measure of a director's ability. Again, that might be something you can infer about my position, but that's not the reason that I included it. Right? The reason I included it was to concede that there are other directors who have received more formal accolades. Right? So I'm trying to make a point about one person being the greatest, but I recognize that they aren't the greatest at everything. They haven't won every award, they haven't done everything, and so I'm conceding a point. So this is something that everyone does in everyday conversation, right? You mention things for a purpose, and it's not just to inform the person you're talking to that this fact exists, right? It's something beyond that. So let's take a look at a question from the actual practice test. So go ahead and take some time to read through this one and get an answer. Okay. In the context of the passage as a whole, the primary function of the sentence in lines 10 through 12 is to blank. So if we go and read that line, it is true that in real life the hand in was a common stance for elite men. Why is that line there? Well, the line itself is not going to tell us why it's there. We're going to need to read around it. In this case, we have to go pretty far back up to figure out what's going on. Right, so the general idea of these first couple lines is the author is wondering, why is it that rich guys back then always got painted with their hand in their waistcoat, right? Why did they always have their portraits painted that way? And they say that some of the reasoning is that it mirrors actual social behavior. And then goes on to say, however, those explanations illuminate neither the source or the reason for its popularity. So the author is concerned that, yes, it's true that elite men would walk around with their hand in their waistcoat like that, but that doesn't explain why it was popular. That doesn't explain where it came from. And so the correct answer here is something like E. Concede that one explanation for the prevalence of a particular portrait type has a basis in fact. Right? The author is mentioning this line not just to inform us that in real life people used to stand like this. It's conceding that, so that explanation, to say that it just mirrored actual social behavior, is at least partially true. Right? It does have a basis in fact.